Not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news, you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news, your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you needed it for drinking and cooking. As you drag yourself from your bed, which is likely just a straw-filled mattress crawling with bedbugs, you realize how every muscle in your body aches. Life in the 1870s frontier involved constant physical labor from dawn until dusk. There were no weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether you were a farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool used until it broke down. You might think you work hard in your modern life, but frontier labor was something entirely different, backbreaking work that left even the strongest people permanently hunched and arthritic by their 30s. Imagine spending 14 hours ploughing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine shaft. No wonder the average lifespan was only about 35 years. Standing on the dusty floor, you notice the chill in the air. If it's winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing inside. If you had a fireplace, you'd have let it burn down overnight to save precious fuel. Good luck finding central heating or thermal underwear in this century. And if it's summer, well, get ready to sweat through every article of clothing you own. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothing, forget comfort. Men typically owned maybe 2 sets of clothes, rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that chafed against the skin. Women wore multiple layers regardless of the temperature. Chemises, corsets, petticoats and long dresses that dragged in the dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting and rarely cleaned. Those fancy outfits you've seen in Western movies? Pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often preserved with salt or smoke because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, when your gums bleed and your teeth fall out, was common among settlers despite being easily preventable with modern knowledge. You might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, but what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It's typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might include crushed eggshells or even salt to reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you drink it without complaint. Before heading outside, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move, and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly, with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved, but are instead dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. The smell hits you again, stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude, one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. The liquor served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life: violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. Speaking of being armed, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, and sometimes for signaling. The constant threat from bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling between settlements. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. As you continue your walk, you pass the local doctor's office. Medical care in the 1870s frontier would horrify you. Most doctors had little or no formal training. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia beyond whiskey or morphine, and sterilization was virtually unknown. Something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death. Common treatments included bloodletting, mercury compounds, arsenic, and other toxic substances that often did more harm than good. Women in childbirth faced mortality rates as high as 1 in 4 in remote areas. Dentistry involved extraction without anesthesia, using crude tools. Most people suffered from painful dental issues for years before finally losing their teeth. If you were injured or fell ill on the frontier, your survival often depended more on luck than medical intervention. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening due to infection. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving frontier folk with chronic pain and disability. The famous phrase, "only the strong survive," had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again, and you realize it's time for lunch. You head to the local restaurant, which is likely just an extension of someone's home where meals are served for a fee. The food isn't any more varied than your breakfast. Meat is tough and often spoiled, despite heavy smoking or salting. Vegetables, if available, are overcooked to mush. Food safety standards don't exist, so dysentery and food poisoning are common occurrences. While eating, you overhear conversations about recent Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or the danger of traveling alone. While Native American violence against settlers was far less common than portrayed in popular culture, in fact, settlers and the US military were far more likely to be the aggressors. The frontier was still a place of conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples created tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they were a genuine threat, particularly in remote areas. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff sometimes responsible for thousands of square miles. In many places, justice was handled through vigilante action rather than formal legal proceedings. Lynch mobs were common, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches might cost the equivalent of $20 in today's money. Many settlers spent most of their income on essential supplies with little left over for comfort or luxury. The store offers another glimpse into frontier reality, the isolation. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or months out of date. Information traveled slowly, and you might go years without news from family back east. Many settlers never saw their relatives again after moving west. The psychological toll of this isolation contributed to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. As the afternoon wears on, you notice dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather on the frontier wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived with little warning. Blizzards could strand travelers, leading to freezing deaths. Tornadoes destroyed entire communities with no emergency services to assist survivors. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops and caused starvation. If you were lucky enough to have a proper home, it provided minimal protection. Most frontier dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were available. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forested regions, or simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter temperatures inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was often unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many people slept. As the storm approaches, you decide to head back to your cabin before it hits. On the way, you pass a group of men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest professions on the frontier. Underground cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, explosions from improperly handled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered from long-term health issues like black lung from coal dust or mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even if you avoided mining, few frontier occupations were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever you did to make a living, your risk of serious injury or death was exponentially higher than in the modern world. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain begins to fall. The roof leaks in several places, and you place buckets to catch the water. This is a good opportunity to refill your drinking water, as clean water was scarce and precious. Many frontier settlers drank from the same sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly turn fatal. As you sit in your leaky cabin listening to the rain, you reflect on how different reality is from the romanticized version of the Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, just people struggling to survive in incredibly harsh conditions. The fact that anyone made it through is testament to human resilience and determination. Night falls early as you have no electricity. Candles and oil lamps provide minimal illumination, and you're careful with them. Fire was a constant danger in frontier homes. A single spark could mean losing everything, with no fire department to call for help. Many towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. You prepare for bed, exhausted from just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache, your stomach is unsettled from the unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the constant vigilance required to stay alive. As you drift off to sleep, you wonder if you'll make it through tomorrow, or if you'll become just another statistic in the dangerous story of the American frontier. The wind howls outside your cabin, a haunting reminder of how small and vulnerable humans are against the vastness of the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to see it, will bring all these challenges again, along with new ones you haven't yet imagined. In the Wild West, survival was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, hour by hour, through hardship most modern people can scarcely comprehend. The morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from a restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. As you rise, you remember yesterday's harsh introduction to frontier life and wonder what new challenges today will bring. Let's say you decide to leave town today to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news? Unless you were relatively wealthy or travelling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks travelled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care, though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles, and if your horse spooked at a snake or sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse miles from any help. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness, similar to seasickness, leaving travellers nauseous and miserable. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travellers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down, with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10-15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that. A grave every 350 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness, caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluid so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Some had ferries or fords, but many required the wagon to be floated across like a makeshift boat. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance with river crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail came from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons but carried them for hunting and protection. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents and spouses along the way, then had to continue travelling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made passes impassable. The constant stress, grief and physical hardship led many travellers to mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among trail migrants. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges weren't over. Many arrived at their destination having spent all their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived destitute, malnourished and ill, only to find that the promised land had its own harsh realities. But let's say you've decided not to travel that far. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did occur regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats to travellers. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travellers. Summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travellers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths or desperate situations like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Navigation itself was challenging in an era before detailed maps. Travellers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies ran low. As you travel today, you notice another aspect of frontier life that movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting ground of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it became U.S. territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their cultures and traditions. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. This diversity, however, didn't mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than white workers. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans who moved west, hoping to escape Southern discrimination, often found frontier racism just as entrenched, if different in form. Despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities, they were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the deliberate destruction of their food sources, particularly the buffalo, decimated numerous tribes and nations. US government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to erase their cultural identity, operating under the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. The romanticized cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. As you continue your journey, you ponder another group whose experience differed markedly from Hollywood depictions: women on the frontier. Far from the helpless damsels or schoolmarms of Western movies, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but also worked in the fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and ended well after dark, with few, if any, days of rest. A frontier woman might need to plough fields in the morning, deliver a neighbour's baby at midday, fight off predators threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout. Many women became widows young